Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
Matt, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas around here everywhere you go, just like in the song. And we got our tree. We're putting up lights. We're getting ready for it. And I got to tell you, I am excited about Christmas. But usually I feel like Christmas is kind of a nice time to pause, take a break, chill out for a second. And this time around, it feels kind of the opposite. I feel like going into Advent, not only am I waiting for the little baby Jesus to come walking down the aisle, but also I feel like I'm just kind of waiting for some insane news about some other event to drop. I feel like there's just been a lot going on. It feels like a pretty anxious and rough social, psychological environment. And I thought, we'll talk about one extremely insane thing that happened recently, but I figured I'd just check in with you, Matt, off the bat. How's that Christmas creep going? How's Advent parsing itself out over there for you?
Well, sitting safely across the pond in a small town in Scotland, it's nice. Here, it's fine. Everything seems cool. It's getting dark really early, and that sucks. It's very cold outside. It's very wet outside, but Christmas is coming, and that's fantastic. But every time I look at my phone to get a peek on what's happening on the other side of the world in the United States, things keep happening too much is my general feeling. There's Donald Trump. We didn't like that. We have maybe more than one episode about how we didn't like it. And that is crazy. We got all these Trump picks that are coming in kind of into the cabinet. That's bad. Climate anxiety, mine's at an all-time high. Not liking that whatsoever. And then in South Korea, there's a president that was trying to impose martial law for a hot second.
He did say sorry.
And then he did say sorry, which is so nice. It's the Christmas spirit for sure. So nice of him. And then, things happening in Syria, things really popping off over there and in a really interesting turn of events. And then in the midst of all of that, an unknown assassin did shoot and kill a United Healthcare CEO. So that's something. Things are happening so much, Dean. And Christmas, it can come if it wants to, but it seems like a lot of other things are coming with it.
It really does. What a time to be welcoming the Prince of Peace into this world. That's right. It is absurd, and I think you did a good job rounding up the absurdities. We could pile on several more, and I'm sure the year will pile on a few more by the time it ends, by the time this month is over. But we were talking together, Matt and I, about what exactly we would even say about what's going on. There's so much. And we thought maybe we could zero in on the last absolutely crazy thing that you had said, the shooting of a United Healthcare CEO. It is something that happened this week, as when we're recording it, that is. So not that long ago. So I don't know. There's not a lot of info about it now, but there is a lot of discourse about it. And man, if there's one thing we can talk about, it's the discourse, and add our own dumb thing to the top of it, our own piece of garbage on the big garbage dump of discourse that is growing every day, that the angel of history does get blown away by. And I think, it is a crazy thing to kind of think through, but it is doubly crazy, I feel like, to think through while Christmas is like getting going. Those two things are really, for some reason, juxtaposed in my brain. But Matt, maybe you could just get us started here. What are the details that we need to know so far before we start thinking about how Christians and Christians on the left might sort of try to contextualize this incredibly bizarre event?
Yeah, whenever we do this whole bit where we're commenting on the commenters, we're discoursing on the discourse, I always think of one of my favorite French guys, Jean Baudrillard, he's a French philosopher, whatever. But during the first Gulf War, they asked him, I think it was like Le Monde or some other French newspaper or magazine. I can't remember which one, actually. They asked him, can you go report on this? And he was like, oh yeah, of course, I'll do that. And then he didn't go to Iraq. He just turned on the TV, and then he started sort of commentating on the way that the reporting was being done on the Iraq War. And I feel like if Jean Baudrillard were still alive today and he saw all of these things that were happening and the ways that people were commenting on them, he would be freaking out. He would not like this whatsoever. So anyways, let me tell you about what's happened, sort of the facts that we're working with on this podcast, and then we're going to talk about the discourse happening around these facts, and then we can talk about our discourse on top of that discourse, and then we'll we'll get to some kind of conclusion somewhere in there. This is what podcasting's all about, baby. On December 4th, an unknown assassin shot and killed United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson outside of an entrance to the New York Hilton in Manhattan. Since December 4th, there hasn't been any new information about the killer besides a decoy backpack containing a coat that the killer was wearing and a bunch of Monopoly money, which makes me think of this guy as a Batman villain 100%. He gave you all the clues. He gave you his Joker-like backpack full of colorful money. Incredible. According to the Associated Press, the bullets that were used in the shooting had the words deny, defend, and depose emblazoned upon them, which is a reference used by insurance industry critics to describe insurers' tactics to avoid paying out claims. Very interesting, actually, in the AP report, they said, supposedly, like kind of giving some distance in case that wasn't quite what was going on. I appreciate the journalistic integrity and distance that they're giving themselves. So overall, the brazenness of the murder is shocking, to say the least. It's a murder on a targeted person in daylight with like sort of some theatrics involved. The assassin himself has not been, or herself, who knows, has not been found, captured. They're on the lam. They're on the run. How interesting. That is all nuts, right? I think even wilder than all of that, after the killing, people across social media made how they feel about the situation extremely clear. It is either very funny or thought-provoking or they do not care. For example, I mean, there's a lot of different ways this is manifested, and I'm sure as a person who yourself is online, you've seen plenty of this and have your own thoughts about this. A Facebook post that United Healthcare made about the killing has received 90,000 laughing reacts at this point. People have, it is super crazy. Usually there's sort of a somberness that we have to kind of deal with when it comes to gun crime, at least for a little bit, to pretend like this is tragic or something. But people have jumped right to laughing reacts, which is pretty nuts. Dean, I'm just going to give you a quick smattering of like tweets and comments and posts I've seen about this in the last few days. These are not like from, famous people. These are just like a few that I've seen that kind of repeat similar sentiment. And then we can figure out what's happening here. Laugh, react, yikes. One person says, today I'm thinking about the time United Healthcare suddenly decided to stop paying for my chemotherapy and didn't bother telling me. So the nurses had to tell me when I checked in at the cancer center for my next treatment. Totally unrelated to any current news, of course. I've seen so many comments just like this of people sort of like having a moment of, I don't know, like, I don't know if it's like payback or vitriol or something, but I get it. I can understand feeling this way, but we'll get to that whole thing in a minute maybe. Some other people said, when you shoot one man in the street, it's murder. When you kill thousands of people in hospitals by taking away their ability to get treatment, you're an entrepreneur. Okay. Somebody else says, saw mainstream news coverage about the killing of a CEO of United Healthcare on TikTok, and I think political and industry leaders might want to read the comments and think about them hard. And then they have a lot of pictures of different comments. I'm sorry, prior authorization is required, thoughts and prayers, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea from this kind of stuff, right? People are commenting on sort of like the extreme brokenness of the system. You see all these comments and you kind of get it, right? People have been burned and hurt and their lives have been destroyed by the healthcare industry in the United States. And they are having a lot of hard times, summoning up a lot of sympathy for the whole situation. I think there's some other comments that maybe even take it in a different direction, that treat the assassin himself more like a folk hero than just sort of like commenting on the situation itself. So it kind of goes off in some different directions and splinters within the discourse. But I don't know, Dean, that's my read. That's what's happening out here on the internet. What's your experience been like in a different part of the world?
No, I mean, I feel like it is a universal kind of thing, except that maybe those of us who live in systems that don't have private healthcare controlling every part of our relationship to the doctors maybe have some different discourse going on, but I don't think it's very interesting. I think, though, what I have been reflecting on a lot is, like, on the one hand, like, I get it. I get why people don't have sympathy for a rich healthcare CEO who was killed, apparently it seems like at this stage, maybe a politically motivated kind of shooting. Who actually knows? I think that's also an important piece. Who actually knows why this guy was shot? But whatever. Those are the theatrics, as you said, are pointing in that direction. But I think, like, I have found myself, I don't know how to put it. I guess what it is I'm really leaning into crab season. I'm mad at everyone and everything, including my ostensible allies on the left, and just a real crabby Christmas around here. And what I mean by that is, like, I understand the reaction. I can contextualize it. It is legible to me. And whatever, it makes sense. It's a natural consequence, you might say, of the social situation that we have. But at the same time, it also is really like filling me with this kind of crabby take that, I don't know, I think killing people in the street is actually bad. And killing a healthcare CEO is like not a good move strategically. And I think my biggest thing, and maybe this is like my deepest Christian impulse, is that this kind of event speaks not only to the failure of the healthcare system, but also to the failures of the left to provide like a real organized movement that could actually get public healthcare. And I think that's kind of the big takeaway for me, is that, like, I don't know, like, this event is not going to achieve public health care in the US. I think it also will just inevitably kind of push people who do want public health care to be further identified with like left-wing wackos who are killing people in the streets, because guess what? That did actually happen. So, I mean, that's wrong to do that, but that's what the right will do. And I don't know, I'm just feeling crabby about it. I'm feeling like nobody wants to think strategically about it. Also, nobody wants to take this as an indictment of the left as well as the kind of capitalist system, that there is no, like, not that people aren't organizing for public health care, because obviously they are, and that's huge, and more power to them. Not a criticism of them per se, but it's just a kind of, to me, like, kind of it's not only a symptom of capitalism, it is also a kind of like symptom of defeat, or like the prolonged defeat of the left. So I don't know, just a crabby event all around. And the laugh react discourse to me is also a kind of like, man, people would rather have a laugh react online than like go to the meeting. That's kind of how I feel at this stage, but just being crabby.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It does speak to like a general feeling of hopelessness or malaise or whatever in society, which I don't know, I think makes a lot of sense. I could understand feeling that way. I get what you're saying, though. I think that also is a good point, that we just went through a whole election cycle where the Democrats, supposedly, according to some, were bringing their A game and didn't really mention healthcare the entire time, huh? Which is frustrating. It seems very embarrassing to me in a lot of ways. I mean, you said it's a failure for the left. I agree. I think that makes sense. But it is very embarrassing that just a few years ago, Medicare for All was like the most important and popular thing to happen. And since Bernard Sanders, didn't win, whatever, all that whole thing happened, that whole saga in American politics played out the way that it did. Bernie Sanders is not the president, and he's not going to ever be the president. No one's picked that up and said, yeah, let's do this because it is popular. And that is so sad. Why is that, I wonder? I mean, whatever, that's the Democrats. They're not going to do it because they are addicted to losing and trying to win over right-wing votes. We've heard about all of that before, but there is outside of the Democrats, there is a left in the United States, and we don't see them pushing that hard for it. I mean, except for the sort of public interest groups that are, which is again good for them. But yeah, quite a frustrating situation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of like such two minds about some of this too, because on the one hand, I think it's good that people are kind of calling attention to the concept of what Engels calls social murder, and we'll talk about it more later on in our own podcast. And I think, like, relative to individual murder and so on, it is important to kind of like think about the way that we kind of decide who is worth mourning in a public way and who deserves to die or doesn't deserve to die and all that kind of stuff. And like, what's the relationship of intentionality to poor people dying versus, a rich person being shot in the street? All these kinds of things are complicated. And I think it's like good to talk about that. But at the same time, like, I think there's a sense among some commentators that, this kind of event, like a big dramatic shooting in the street, is getting people talking. And that's like good enough. Like that will be the thing that kind of tips the scales or achieves a political win or victory or whatever. And to me, that is such a lazy way of thinking. And what frustrates me about it is like, it's one of those shortcut ways of thinking that if we just kind of have the right attitude, or like everybody talks to each other. It's ironically a kind of liberal fantasy to me, that leftists sometimes adopt, that it's just a matter of getting people talking or like raising consciousness and all that kind of stuff. And I think to me, that's the thing, is like, that's why I'm of two minds. I think it's good people are talking about it. I don't think talking about it is enough. And I would hope that the kind of conclusion that we would come to would be like, yeah, we can talk about it all day, but unless people are going to really build a movement that could achieve these things, that's all you're ever going to do about it. And to me, that is like, yeah, maybe embarrassing is the right word for it. Just like a huge bummer that that's the conclusion most people are going to come away with.
No, exactly. I think it's right to point out that it is a type of shortcut thinking, and those of us on the left, we know very well, because we've all read that one Jane McAlevey book.
At least the
there
title
are no
of
shortcuts to win power. Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, it's frustrating because that's the difference, right? Is that there are moments in history and, you know, in politics, whatever, that are sort of philosophical, that like they happen and they make you think about something and they put something in a new light and whatever. Maybe it wins people over towards a certain way of thinking or not. But a moment like this has, I think, like pretty drastic ramifications, I think, for the left in the future, especially what you said a minute ago about how the right will end up framing this. I think that is probably true. Regardless, I mean, of how, you know, all that to say that like the people who are laugh reacting, I think, are probably not all on the left and they're not all on the right, and probably a lot of them are just like apolitical people out there in the world who are, you know, experiencing something and having a thought about it for the first time, and like whatever. This is not the the step that will finally like get affordable or like universal healthcare for all people in the United States.
Yeah, and I think thinking about it as a Christian person, obviously, like lots of Christian people have and will continue to have kind of statements about this is very bad and nobody should like it and we shouldn't like, you know, someone being shot, and thoughts and prayers to this person's family and so on. And like, there's a part of me that kind of sympathizes with that. Like, the CEO is very bad. He's a bad person, part of a bad system, responsible for a lot of bad things. But like, I do think there's a kind of like, whatever, maybe I just haven't purged my like the liberalism in my own Christianity, but I do think there's a kind of like ultimate affirmation of the sacredness of life that does make me hesitant to be like, this guy had it coming, you know, like, I don't know if that's true. Like, a lot of people have it coming, sorry, you know, and that's like including maybe some of us in the global north. And I think that's like a bad kind of dangerous road to go down. I also think there's like a qualitative difference between, you know, violence in a revolutionary situation, like say you're like fighting in the Saint Denis store or something, and like, you know, arbitrary vigilantism or terrorism. Like, these are different kinds of things, and it's important to figure that out. But I do think like there is a sort of Christianity piece of me that also says, okay, well, we can register that like maybe this person didn't deserve to get shot in the middle of the street. Or definitely, I won't even say maybe. I think he definitely didn't deserve to be just randomly shot in the street. But I think like the other kind of Christian response is to say, okay, because we care that this person shouldn't just be killed, you know, we should expand that kind of impulse to also think about all the other people who shouldn't be killed or left behind in the system that we have. And that's the sort of social murder tie that I think matters. And the kind of unique thing that a liberative Christianity could bring to a situation like that, to say that, like, it's not only one person who should be mourned, even though I do think that that's bad. But there are, you know, countless other cases of people being killed every single day by kind of social systems that this person is partly responsible for. And yes, I agree. We should we should have a discourse about that. And maybe this is the chance to kind of like take advantage of that moment without affirming it per se.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When I was hearing about this, I was actually thinking a little bit about the parable, the tenant, the wicked tenants, you know, the tenants in the vineyard that's in Mark. We talked about that in the episode about parables as subversive speech by William Herzog. The parable is interpreted in a lot of different ways, especially that the tenants themselves are sort of the bad guys for kind of disobeying the landowner and killing his son, if I recall correctly. In the way that William Herzog tells the story in Parables as Subversive Speech, he kind of explains it as Jesus' warning against a peasant rebellion with extremely diminishing returns. Herzog says that it's like Jesus saying that there's a sort of a spiral of violence that you can get yourself caught up in, and that it's not the decisive victory that you think it will be unless you're in this sort of different situation. Right. So anyways, that's kind of where my brain went to, at least, is that there is this, I don't know, I mean, right now it's one thing that's happened and whatever, but it could end up being sort of part of a cycle of violence, sort of a descent into ugliness in the United States that won't win anybody anything, which is unfortunate. But I suppose we'll have to wait and see, I guess, how things shake out. Regardless, whether or not it becomes like a real cycle of violence and the sort of like, people killing other people and then more violence on top of that, it is something that will definitely be used as like a bludgeon against people on the left who are demanding things like healthcare. Mm-hmm. So there's different kinds of cycles of violence, I suppose.
Well, okay, so we have the first big point to put on the whiteboard of this podcast, which is shooting people in the street is not good. That's the first thing you got to know for your notes at home. That being said, we should talk about other ways that people are killed in the streets by the system. And I do think that it is important to kind of take advantage or exploit this kind of situation to talk through some of those other pieces, not as a way of endorsing it or to say that, like, because people are talking about it again, that is good, but nevertheless, let's talk about it. So I mentioned a minute ago that Engels, the great friend and partner of Karl Marx, he is actually a kind of underrated thinker in his own right. And he has this concept of what he calls social murder that is pretty cool. I think it's very useful on the left. It has actually been taken up a lot in critical theories of healthcare and also some other stuff like related to housing and, I don't know, more like policy stuff, which I think is cool because it's harder to get that out of Marx, actually. I mean, Marx gives you like some interesting tools for thinking about policy and politics, but Engels, I don't know, he supplies some interesting, more sociological analysis. And I thought I'd read a passage that's kind of been going around, which is good, and maybe we could talk that through. So it comes from his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, and I'll just read this little paragraph here, and then we can talk it through. So he says, when one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, such an injury that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call this deed murder. But when a society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they can't live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequence. When that person, or when that society knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain, its deed is murder just as surely as the deed of the single individual. Disguised, malicious murder, murder against which none can defend himself, which does not see what it is because no man sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than commission, but murder it remains. Man, Engels, a great writer, underrated rhetorician, but I really like the way that he puts it here, right? That, like, when two people meet each other in space and, like, one person is killed, like this healthcare CEO, that is a murder. We recognize that as a murder. It is, there's a legal process to identify it as such and so on. But when multitudes of people die from also things that are totally, like, obvious, like everybody knows that this will lead to death, like, bad housing conditions or people not being able to afford to go to the doctor or people waiting on treatment and all these kinds of things, when that inevitably leads to death and everybody knows that it will lead to death, we don't call that murder, or we don't really have a kind of legal framework to identify that as a crime or something bad. That's kind of just like the natural violence and the natural murder that capitalism accepts as being basically fine or acceptable within the system. And that is an important point to drive home, that as people mourn the death of one person, they fail to kind of mourn or understand the impact of that person's choice on the lives or entire career and life on the lives of multitudes of other people. And I think that is like a huge concept that Engels contributes to the repertoire, and one that maybe can also kind of help us think about how to, like, figure out where to go from a big news event like that. Like how that kind of opens us up to thinking more about organizing rather than just like celebrating or criticizing or complaining or whatever else.
Right. And first of all, let me say it's great that Engels says it. I'm I'm here for it. Thank you so much, Friedrich Engels, a long dead dude, for saying this thing that I think is true. But also, this bears out, I think, in the actual facts. Right? Not only did some extremely dead dude say this, but it is actually true in real life, which is it's great when those two things line up. I really appreciate that. In 2019, the University of California, Riverside did a study trying to kind of figure out the largest mortality risks in the US. And you're never going to believe what they are. Just kidding. Yes, you will. Um, the top three are things that you would probably guess. Things like heart disease, cancer, and smoking. And then the fourth one, though, is cumulative poverty. So people who've been in poverty for 10 plus consecutive years. That's the fourth leading cause of mortality in the United States, is just being a poor person. And I mean, I think the first three are actually interesting because they also probably have something to do with being poor as well, or some other socioeconomic factors. I mean, listen, I'm not a social scientist. What do I know? Anyways, it seems true. The National Institute of Health reported that cumulative poverty was associated with approximately 60% greater mortality than current poverty. So, like, if you are in poverty for 10 plus years, and if you're in poverty for 1 year, you have a 60% greater mortality risk than just being in poverty for 1 year. So all I'm trying to say is that these are real facts. Social murder has a real impact on people's lives.
Thanks for bringing data to prove that, once again, that this dead German man was correct.
He knew some things.
He knew some things. Just to kind of add to it too, I mean, there's been, like I said a minute ago, a lot of work kind of digging up this concept and applying it in a number of ways. And also lots of other like oppression factors that you can figure out from it. Like, Ruth Wilson Gilmore has that great summary of racism as foreshortened lifespans, like intentionally foreshortened lifespans or disproportionate, whatever. You get the point. She says it a lot better than I can remember off of my brain right now. But the idea that racism has to do with, exactly that as well. It's a kind of social murder, but distributed in a particular way. There's also been a lot on even like women's health and like maternal death rates and all that kind of stuff across race and class. So just to say that it's like a concept that I think once you start thinking about things that way, which is to say like in a more collective way, or thinking about systemic and structural factors, it really drives home exactly what those kind of structures are. And it also, I think, expresses how bad liberal capitalism is at recognizing the violence that it rests on. There's like, if they catch this guy who killed Brian Thompson, they're going to put him on trial and he'll, whatever, go to jail, prison, death row, whatever. And like, that's, like a legal kind of process to like identify a crime and then do something about it, I guess, usually bad. But we don't have even a legal way of identifying the crime of social murder. And even when we do recognize things like through whatever, a class action lawsuit or something like that, these kinds of things are not sort of dealt with in terms of like the gravity that we would think about when there are just two human beings at play, or when there's a kind of like simpler narrative to violence. Two people meet each other, hurt each other, kill each other, whatever. You can talk to those people. You can build a bit of a story. Even if you could build a really strong story around collective dispossession or collective foreshortening of lifespans, etc., the best case scenario is like, I don't know, the victims of that will get like a few $1,000s or something from like a gigantic pool of money that, is not really going to like restore them or make them whole. And I think that is like also a huge kind of indictment of just the way that our society thinks. And also just to say maybe the mirror side of it is like, I think getting locked into that kind of individualizing narrative is also a bit of a like a bit of a limiting factor for even thinking about this particular situation, right? Like the idea that you would just go shoot a healthcare CEO and like that would, I don't know, accomplish something is also symptomatic of that kind of liberal individual brain disease, I think. Like it's precisely the opposite. Like people need to invest in building the kind of collective agency to exercise that can withstand or kind of confront the collective agency that capitalists exercise just by virtue of kind of being at the top of the system. And I think that is also a huge just kind of like I don't know. Something I'm thinking about a lot in light of this particular case.
This is sort of from the back of my brain, so I'm hopefully I won't get any of these details wrong. But if I do, I'm so sorry. In St. Louis, where I used to live, it is a city that is still being haunted and in a lot of ways still redlining black people within the city. That type of redlining, by which I mean like finding some legal and extra legal ways of forcing people of color to live in particular neighborhoods within St. Louis. That's, I guess, what I mean, redlining. Making it really hard for them to buy a house in a white neighborhood or live in a white neighborhood. There's a long legacy of that in St. Louis. That's all I'm trying to say. There was a study that was done by Washington University, which is like one of the big universities over there in St. Louis. the biggest one, you might say. They were doing this whole thing where they were studying the lifespans, the mortality of people who lived in like the most segregated and redlined communities that were predominantly people of color, black working class communities, in comparison with like white working class communities and even like, I guess, not working class communities as well. In the more affluent neighborhoods, it's something like it was like a huge average. Like people who lived in the white communities would end up living like almost like 6 years longer or something than people who live in the black communities. Like, and I guess like that's a crazy example because it is so stark and awful and gross and bad. But like that's social murder. That's what it looks like. The reason that whole sort of drawn out story is necessary is that you don't fix it by like assassinating a guy. It won't. You can't do it. It won't help anything in any sort of sense except, you know, the ways that it has done, except like spurring like people to talk about it online. I don't know. That's kind of the most you're going to get out of it. Yeah. So it ends up being a really frustrating situation. I understand. And it's even a hard one to communicate because like you have to do all this like social scientific analysis and show people that this is the case and try to convince people that it's the case. And, you know, still most people don't know or probably don't really care about it. But all that being said, like nothing really changes because of, you know, terrorism, because of violence like that. You have to actually like do something en masse, right? That's the only real solution.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There's actually, okay, this is stupid, but I'm going to say it. There's a comic book called Batman White Knight, and it is one of the best Batman comics, although I think okay, the guy who made it, his name is Sean Murphy. He wrote and illustrated it. He is very cool. I think that he fails to land the point at a certain point and kind of like doesn't really get what is super interesting about the thing that he is doing. But the beginning of it is so great. The basic principle is that the Joker, he has this like very funny master plan to make a long story short, kind of like humiliate Batman. And the Joker, in response, ends up like, instead of being the Joker for a variety of reasons, he runs for city council of Gotham and wins. And all of a sudden, he's like talking to the lumpen proletariat of Gotham, essentially being like, "Hey, Batman, he kind of sucks, huh? Like, he's out there, he'll like blow up your house or whatever if it means catching the Penguin or something, and that's very bad. And like, there should be laws. Like, Batman shouldn't just be able to do whatever he's gonna do." And everybody's like, "Whoa, you're totally right." And all of a sudden Batman is getting like regulated in this really complicated way, which is very funny. And it kind of like gives the lie to Batman as the libertarian power fantasy that it is. And what's great is the Joker also recognizes that like running around and being a vigilante himself is actually not kind of like accomplishing what he wants either, which is to like humiliate the Batman. So the best way to humiliate Batman is to like, I don't know, get him in political trouble. I think that's great. Bury him in paperwork and so on. But anyway, I won't explain what's wrong about it. But what I think is great about the comic is that it kind of catches on this really unique sort of funny thing about how people in the US and maybe the rest of us who are influenced by the US unavoidably think about things like crime and punishment and even social problems, that like these are basically heroic kind of battles between not just good and evil, but like individuals, you know. And you might have a Brian Thompson, or you might have the shooter of Brian Thompson or whatever. But the problem with the shooter of Brian Thompson, besides just being a murderer, I guess, is that like he doesn't make the right Joker move, which is to like not shoot the guy, but instead, you know, run for city council or like go to your local meeting or, you know, talk to your neighbors and all that kind of stuff. And I think that is like the kind of thing that people have to get away from is like the sort of superheroizing of I don't know, politics that, you know, we're just all kind of forced into one way or another. Like the hard part is that organizing against social murder is a lot more work than just shooting somebody, frankly. And I think that is a big thing that I would hope leftists could kind of like take the time to sort out, but I'm not really like holding my breath at this stage.
There's so much to say about that aspect of it, where the appearance of death and violence is something that gets people extremely excited. And that's bad, I would say. And hopefully even the people who think it's like cool or whatever can see how bad it is when you say it like that. I mean, people are like horny for violence to appear before them. That is something that gets them very excited, and it always has, and it probably always will. That's the human brain. Read psychoanalysis, learn all about it, I guess. But and I guess like that is the seductive part of it, though, is that it does seem easy, it does seem flashy. It's just like it happens in movies. A guy kills a bad guy, and we love that. But it is not going to win in politics. It's not going to make the change that you want. The Batman example is actually so great because Batman, for all of the work that he's out there doing, he's pounding the pavement, he's catching those bad guys. The world's greatest detective. He's actually not changed anything in Gotham, for the better. Gotham is still Gotham. It's still full of bad guys. And you might even argue that Gotham is full of bad guys because Batman does exist. So I don't know. It makes you wonder. So anyways, all that's bad. We can say that for sure. The more pressing issue is like, how do you stop social murder? And especially since we're a Christian podcast, we can ask, like, how should Christians think about social murder? How should we think about stopping social murder? These are all great questions. And I think that actually Christians have a particular advantage in thinking about social murder because our religion is definitely founded upon the act of social murder. I mean, there's lots of the Gospels are full of people who are like systematically excluded, right? That is a big part of the Bible. That is a big part of the Gospels, is a big part of the Old Testament. This is like, we get all of the stuff in the prophets about the widows and the orphans and people trampling their grain and stuff from Amos or whatever in Isaiah. Lots of good stuff out there. Our religion has a lot to say about social murder. I don't know, Dean, what do you think about that part?
I think you're right. I think you're right. And I think, too, I mean, the episodes we did on the parables a long time ago, but also the Richard Horsley stuff we did on Christmas last year, this kind of like, there's a whole kind of wing of biblical scholarship that tries to see Jesus as not only like a miracle worker, but somebody who's doing popular education and political education. And something that he's doing over and over again is trying to actually call people's attention to the system of social murder that they live in first century Rome. And I think that is really cool and important and an instructive example for us. I mean, you cited that parable of the wicked tenants, which I think is a great one. Lots of other examples of Jesus just kind of like taking the time to really explain what's going on. And I think that like there is something to like figuring out Jesus as a person who's trying to build a counter collective in the shadow of the Roman Empire, that like, Jesus's community is the one that after he leaves decides to become a primitive communist group, like people who sell their stuff and share their stuff, and nobody's going hungry because everybody's kind of taking care of one another. It's a kind of community defined by mutual aid. And I think that does kind of set up, it doesn't set up Christians. It should set up Christians to think harder about how to do those two things at the same time. Like how to think about what are the kind of communal structures we need in order to both survive and resist the empire that we live in now. And also like, how do we take the time to really like understand and dissect and communicate why the system that we live in is bad and how it's harming people, and what our economic situation is really doing to folks. And obviously that's something that liberation theologians have been doing a bunch, and we can talk more about that. But I think even just that basic Christian impulse to be like, it's not only about making sure that we're like good or our communities are good, but also making sure that we are like understanding what's going on and educating people, in a popular way about that sort of thing.
When we were kind of talking about this episode, the thing that we were trying to think of like, well, what's the in for liberation theology, or like what does liberation theology have to say about social murder? And there's probably a lot we could bring in, but the thing that definitely came up for both of us was Ignacio de la Curia, who is a Spanish Salvadorian theologian and priest. He wrote an essay a bit in a big book of systematic theology, of liberation theology and stuff, called The Crucified People. And in the essay that Alacuria writes, he has this take that makes social murder sort of like the center of the Christian story in a really powerful way. So, when we tell the story of Jesus's death at Easter or whenever, we're always talking about it. We can never stop. Sometimes the theology of the situation like overshadows maybe the material reality of what that actually means. And Alacuria kind of tries to go out of his way to tell you that, this guy Jesus, he's killed by Rome, right? And all kinds of other competing forces probably had a hand in it as well, whatever. Even you and me. I've been to Sunday school. I know all about that part. But, the thing that Alacuria gets to at the end, though, is that, like, Jesus is crucified for the same reason that all kinds of rabble-rousers are crucified. The reason that, all kinds of poor people are crucified every day. Because that's just the way that it is. Because power crushes, basically anyone standing in the way, especially people who are trying to stop that power from crushing people. So Alacuria kind of takes this example of Jesus and people like Jesus, and he comes up with this term called the crucified people. I'll just read this bit here from his essay, so I don't have to ramble through it anymore. Alacuria writes, "Thus, the crucified people has a twofold thrust. It is the victim of the sin of the world, and it is also the bearer of the world's salvation. But this second aspect is not what we are developing here in terms of the Pauline, died for our sins and rose for our justification. This present chapter, halting at the crucifixion, presents only the first stage. A stage focused on the resurrection of the people should indicate how the one crucified for the sins of the world can, by rising, to contribute to the world's salvation. Salvation does not come through the mere fact of crucifixion and death. Only a people that lives because it has risen from death inflicted on it can save the world." What Alacuria is saying here is kind of what we're saying in this podcast, but in a better and more eloquent and theologically sound way, of course. That the whole point, the point of the resurrection isn't it's not the big flashy moment, right? That's not what we should be paying attention to. The point instead of salvation is that we keep doing the work of salvation, that you keep standing in the way of death. You keep finding the people who are crucified in the world, and you keep trying to get them to not be crucified anymore. You take them off the cross. You tell everyone which neighborhoods are hazardous for the health of people to live in. Which neighborhoods are going to kill people because of environmental factors. Which healthcare systems don't really give a shit about people's life and death and that need to be changed substantively. These are the moments of salvation and resurrection, getting rid of crucifixion altogether. And that's not flashy work. That's not exciting work. It is showing up work, which is unfortunate. It's not the kind of thing that you can see on TV or in a movie and that you'll get really excited about it. It's boring stuff that you have to do and that you have to learn about. And if you want to, really change the world, that's what you have to do.
I think you're right. What I love about Alacuria is that for him, it's not that the death and resurrection of Christ is not unique or interesting or special or important or whatever. And the whole essay,
Right.
by the way, is very good and worth reading. But it's actually the opposite. It's because his death and resurrection are so unique, he's actually initiating something in history that human beings are expected to kind of repeat and continue throughout the rest of history. And, the big question is how do you get people off the cross? And I think, to hazard a really awkward analogy, I guess, in this specific situation we're talking about, the people are being crucified by health insurance and so on. And I don't think that you get them off the cross by shooting a healthcare CEO. That is not going to do it. And I think the harder question is well, how do you really pull that off? And obviously nobody has the magic wand to do it. And two guys on a podcast don't either. Otherwise we would just wave it and sort it out. But I think it is that kind of message of the people have to understand their own kind of agency as people, figure out how to sort that out. I think, for example, it's really great that people are sharing their own stories about how they've been screwed over by the healthcare industry. And to be clear, I have time for people also saying we shouldn't I don't know, go out of our way to like have a collective day of mourning for like Brian Thompson. You know, like I was thinking of there's that verse in Proverbs 11 something where they say it says something like when it goes well with like righteous people rejoice, but when the wicked die, there's rejoicing. You know, like there's a kind of recognition even in the Bible that like, okay, when when someone who's bad dies, it's not the case that everybody just kind of like, I don't know, gets in line and like mourns that person as though they were a great person or something. And there's a kind of recognition that some people are responsible for a lot of social evil. You know, that's in the Bible itself. So don't get me wrong, like I get it, I hear that. But I think the good thing about people sharing, you know, what's going on with them is like that should be a kind of connective tissue for people to figure out, all right, like there are common interests here. There are actually kind of a lot of people who are willing to like do something about how bad the healthcare system is, or at the very least are willing to signal that something should be done. I mean, I think it falls to people on the left to then figure out, okay, that's like a big challenge for us. Like, how do we figure that out? How do we create the kind of apparatus necessary to collect that energy, collect those people, and to get them to not only share their individual stories, but to like share them with one another and kind of figure out the strategy that they need to get, you know, to get the goods, to like not let that happen again. And I think that's the big thing that Eucharia gives us as Christians, is to be like, all right, we should get the crucified people off the cross, and that means doing the hard work of figuring it out.
Right. To get people off the cross, you have to become the Joker, but the very specific White Knight Joker who becomes city council member. Now, I think that makes sense though, what you're saying. I mean, like if I was organizing around healthcare in the United States right now, I would be on social media platforms DMing everybody who had a great, powerful story about, you know, how United Healthcare or whatever insurance company has screwed them over, and like, you come to a meeting, come to anything, come and talk to us about your experience. I mean, it's like there are all these people who are really riled up about it right now, and this could be a moment for organizing if you want it to be. So maybe you should want it to be.
Maybe you should want it to be. Yeah. So I don't know. Going into Advent, waiting for Christmas, waiting for the Prince of Peace, and kind of having that season of anticipation also be a bit of a season of anticipation for like many more very insane things to happen between now and Christmas. I feel like those are the kinds of things that are going to stick with me, is like, what is the sort of moment that Jesus is incarnating into the world or initiating in the world? And I do think that it's this kind of like way of thinking about human relationships that isn't reducible to just like, I don't know, if you kill a bad guy, then everything will sort itself out. You know, there's like something about Jesus's entire life is like a fundamental suspicion of that sort of idea. And instead that Jesus is being like, I don't know, could we like create a whole new kind of person interested in like understanding what's going on, communicating that, and taking care of each other in the midst of all that. And I don't know, that's what I'm waiting for baby Jesus to come sort it out for us this time, to really make us all great popular organizers. What about you, Matt? How is this all factoring into your Advent practice?
Oh man, yep. I feel like every day is opening an Advent calendar where something worse happens than yesterday. Or maybe just crazier than yesterday. I don't know. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. We'll see what they're like. I feel like I'm so hesitant to even say something that's just like, well, what's going to happen tomorrow? I have no idea. But yeah, we're on that long march to Christmas. Everyone's getting ready to give their best gifts to baby Jesus, and like, let's hope that it is, yeah, it's Jane McAlevy's No Shortcuts. It is William Foster's Industrial Unionism. I don't know. Let's get those real good. No frankincense, no myrrh, no gold. Let's just get some good dusty books out there for this baby.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. Also, we have new merch for all the bone perverts out there on our Redbubble shop at redbubble.com/the Magnificast. You can find a great new design of one of these spooky capuchin monk skeletons. You can get it on a sticker. You can get it on a t-shirt. You can get it on whatever insane products they randomly put it on. But it's there, and it would be great if you got a bone sticker for your loved ones for Christmas. I'm sure they're going to love that and not ask you anything.
Can you imagine getting the bone t-shirt from the podcast, the Magnificast, and then you go to Rome and you show up to the real bone church, and they're like, do you want to buy a t-shirt? And you're like, no, I've already got one.
You could really stand outside of the bone church and be the official shusher with a Magnificast bone church t-shirt. And I think that is something that someone ought to do for sure.
I think that if they saw you coming with that shirt on, though, they'd be like, no, I'm sorry. You cannot come in.
Yeah, that's right. They're going to have they'll turn people away. If you're wearing this t-shirt, you cannot come in. They'll have a sign at the front of the chiesa, the church. But you can go get one and alienate your friends and others, friends and enemies alike, at redbubble.com/the Magnificast. Our music is by Maria Armstrong. Our outro is by the Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between.